Now, this one is going to be cool. We're going to look at slowing down and speeding up video. I'm going to be using this time project you'll find in the Chapter 6 folder if you'd like to follow along. And this has a clip of Paavo doing some cool unicycle tricks, jumping off of stairs on a unicycle. So what we want to do is slow this footage down to really make it sing. So what we're going to do is go to this top bar in the timeline panel, right-click on it, and under Columns, select Stretch. The stretch value is basically how much we're stretching the clip. If we click and drag on this stretch value and increase it, let's say to 157%, basically what that's going to do is make the duration of the clip 157% of the original value, or in other words, 1.5 times as long. Now, if you're going to stretch out a clip that much, then when you play it back, it's going to be significantly slower. Let's take this to 300%. Now, instead of scrubbing to get 300%, I'm actually going to click the stretch value to open up the time stretch dialog box. Then I'm simply going to type 300 and press return. Now if I preview this, it goes much slower. Now if I were to take a stretch value below 100%, let's say for example 50%, that means that the clip lasts half as long, and so because of that, it has to go twice as fast. And let's watch that played back in real speed. Woo! Looks like something out of a 1920s movie or something. That's pretty good. There's another way that's used oftentimes in After Effects to play with time, and that is by using the time warp effect. In the Effects and Presets panel at the bottom, you'll see the time category. And this time warp effect is basically like stretch, but with a little bit more control. So I'm going to drag and drop this time warp effect on this clip, and I could see it here in my Effects and Presets panel. Now there's a little glitch in the program here. When I apply the time warp effect, my color adjustment effects don't show up, but that's okay for the time being. One of the cool things about the time warp effect as opposed to time stretch is that we basically have this speed parameter, and essentially speed works the exact opposite of stretch. So a big stretch value slows down your footage, but a big speed value makes it really fast. The cool thing about this is that we can animate it. So let's say, for example, we have Paavo going 100% speed until he launches. So what I'm going to do is click a stopwatch for the speed value. And actually, let me take this to 100%. And then I'll move out a few frames. And then I'll slow this way down. And then I'll move a few frames. And I'll take this back to 100. And so if I hit the home key and I preview this, he goes normal speed. Now this is rendering, so it's going to go a little bit slower, obviously. And then he launches, and then he goes very, very, very slow in midair. So if you ever watch sports commercials or whatever, this is a very common trick. The footage will go really, really quick until the moment of action, and then it goes very, very slowly to accentuate what's going on. Basically, we've got the gist of it so far, so if that's all you're looking for, then you could go ahead and stop watching this movie. But for those of you that want a few extra tips and tricks, then check this out. Motion blur. Now, motion blur, we'll talk about this in the next chapter when we look at blur effects. But essentially, motion blur is something that After Effects adds to things that you animate. But the time warp effect can add motion blur to already rendered video footage. What it does is it looks at things that move and it blurs them after the fact, which is very impressive. Also, the method at the top, we have whole frames, frame mix, and pixel motion. The default is pixel motion, which is the most high quality of all the settings. It's going to give you the smoothest results for playback. So as we back up one frame here, After Effects is trying to recreate every single one of these frames that isn't a real frame. Imagine this. Imagine if you had a clip that was 5 minutes long and you stretch it to be half the speed. Well, that 5-minute long clip is then going to be 10 minutes long. But there's only 5 minutes worth of frames. So in order to come up with those extra frames, After Effects has to do something. And if we select whole frames, then those frames just get copied. If we select frame mix, then those frames are blended together using opacity. But if we select pixel motion, then After Effects actually looks at those two frames and tries to create the frames that should be in between them. So if you want to speed things up because it's going too slow just while you're working, you could take things down to frame mix or even whole frames just to speed things up. When it's time for rendering, though, you go back to pixel motion for the smoothest possible quality. Now, I should also point out here that when you're stretching in the timeline, there is this little icon over here in the timeline panel, this frame blending icon, which is essentially the same exact thing as this method dropdown. So if we enable frame blending for the entire composition, we can enable it for each individual layer. If we click once, we'll get this pixelated little backslash, which indicates frame mix. That means the frames are going to blend together using opacity. But if we click again, we'll get a forward slash that is smooth, and this indicates pixel motion. Adjusting time in the timeline panel is really quick. Your cursor is almost always down there on the timeline panel, so it's really quick and easy to apply stretch here. However, the stretch value here cannot be animated. If you want things to speed up and then slow down the same clip, you've got to use the time warp effect.